Welcome to you all. My name's Peter Harris. I'm the Commercial Services Manager at CSCT. Welcome to the first CSCT Events Forum. The concept of forum is an ancient one, a medium for sharing ideas as fully as possible, where assumptions are challenged and, perhaps, new threads emerge. Today, we're very fortunate to have two widely acclaimed experts in the field of counselling, Professor Dave Means and Michael Jacobs, who will explore the theme of colleagues or opponents, a dialogue between person-centred and psychodynamic therapy. Dave and Michael will initially present the two models and explore their distinctive aspects and also the areas of convergence. Without pulling any punches, they'll address the following burning issues. Is person-centred therapy now paying more attention to psychodynamics? And is psychodynamic therapy attending more to the real relationship? Is there substance to the criticism each has historically made of the other? Is this criticism only reflective of each other's examples of bad practice? Is there respective good practice? Are they actually closer than we think? Could each approach gain from dialoguing with the other? Or are the differences so fundamental that they're at the level of values and each must protect itself by decrying the other? Well, Michael and Dave are here ready to engage with these questions and each other and all those who choose to join them. Gladina McMahon, a cognitive behavioural psychotherapist and also international published author, will chair the proceedings. And we're expecting a lively debate and discussion.
If we can just start out with you, Michael, if you'd like to present an overview, really, of the distinctive features and the cutting edge of psychodynamic theory.
Now, I want to make a distinction between psychodynamic and psychoanalytic. For me, it's a very, very important distinction. As a psychodynamic therapist, I am informed constantly, and I shall explain this in a minute, by psychoanalytic writing, and I value that writing immensely. But I do not like the term psychoanalytic for two reasons, and I prefer the term psychodynamic for obvious reasons, because the term psychoanalytic has the impression that we are putting someone, as it were, on an operating table and dissecting them, and taking them apart in order to discover how they tick and so on. And that, I have to say, is not my way of thinking. My way is to prefer the word dynamic, that there is a constant dynamic within each person, between persons and the environment and so on. And it's that constant dynamic that I so value. So I do not want to be called, or I want to address certainly some of the criticism of psychoanalysis, but I do not want to be called psychoanalytic. And the other reason is that some of the psychoanalytic politics sickens me. And psychodynamic seems to me to be a more generous, more open way of looking at ourselves and our relationships, and I am not the only person who therefore would want to claim the word psychodynamic, because I know that there are humanistic practitioners who would want to emphasize the psychodynamic as well. So I want to make that plain before I start. I also want to say that I acknowledge that, and I'm sure that Dave and others will be drawing attention to some of the weaknesses of psychoanalytic theory and practice, and that's fine, but I am not a defender of bad practice, and I will point out when I think there is bad practice. So I will acknowledge bad practice, but I will not defend it. Now let me move on then to the distinctive features, as I see them, of psychodynamic therapy. And again, I want to stress that I'm not in any of this saying that what I am describing does not exist in its own counterpart in any other therapy as well. Let me just give you an illustration of the first feature that I want to draw attention to. It's the richness of psychoanalytic theory and practice. You see, what so often is psychoanalysis and psychodynamic work is viewed as is a monolithic system. And yet when I think about the key writers, and if you are in the psychodynamic tradition, you will recognize the names that I am going to go through now. If you're not, you will recognize some of them, and you will know of their importance. But I think of the difference between these people, between Freud and Adler and Jung, for a start. They are all psychodynamic. Between Klein, Ferenczi, Winnicott, Bowlby, R.D. Laing, all psychodynamic. Of course, with other accretions to them. In the case of Bowlby and Laing, one could immediately think of it. If we think about Charles Rycroft, Peter Lomas, Anna Freud, Harold Searles, Christopher Bolas, Robert Langs, Fairbairn, Guntrip. In France, Lacan. In America, Daniel Stern, Mahler, Jacobson, thinking about child development. About the neo-Freudians, Fromm, Erich Fromm, Horney, and so on. The feminist therapists, Choderau, Orbach, Kohut, Kernberg, and so on. It is not a monolithic system at all, and there are profound disagreements between those people who call themselves psychoanalytic, arguing from very different positions. And that richness is part of the richness, of course, of today as well, that we come from different positions and we learn from it. The second point that I want to make is, and again, you see, I'm not saying that other traditions are not rich too, and I'm not saying that other traditions also do not work from therapy towards theory. But I want, again, to put this forward, because so often the argument is that it's the theory which is being pushed into the therapy. But let's go back. Let's go back historically. Let's go back historically to Freud, for example, and how Freud was listening to his patients, and when they told him to, one of them told him to stop asking questions, he says, I fell in with that. And he began to listen to them. And he began to develop a way of working which was not the usual medical model, of constantly trying to argue, to diagnose, to take part, and so on, even though he wanted to call it science and psychoanalysis. And that start, which can get lost with bad practice, but that start has been continued. And one of the big criticisms that, of course, comes from the behaviorist school of psychoanalysis is that there is no consistent research, that is all based on individual work. Of course it is based on individual work, because what the psychoanalytic, psychodynamic therapist does, as much perhaps as anyone else does, is to work from the client, from the patient, back, and to develop from that some tentative ideas and theories, which are always capable of adaptation, so that we work from therapy to theory. And these different theories that we have, and there are many different theories on all sorts of concepts within the psychoanalytic tradition, those many different theories can be drawn upon in the work that we're doing, not at a level where we're having to force people into theories, but where sometimes the theory helps us to understand something that we have heard. Rustin, in a book called Reason and Unreason, writes this, that psychoanalysts are interested in the particular experiences of their individual patients, not merely in what attributes or symptoms they share with others. Their method of work avoids much standardization other than of the boundaries and basic techniques of clinical work. And I shall come back to this again perhaps in the day, but let's just remind ourselves of that wonderful saying of Wilfrid Bions, that you must enter the therapy room without memory, without desire, without understanding. That's a very profound thought, and it is something that is very, very difficult to achieve, and it is, I know, very similar to some of the ideas that Carl Rogers was himself saying, but they are said quite independently of each other. So we're talking here about useful models, but not templates into which people have to be fitted. And then let's move on to the richness of the models and the applications of psychoanalysis, because I've already mentioned many names, but then let's just begin to look at some of the different models. There's the Freudian drive model, not instinct theory, but drive model. Let's translate the words correctly, please. There's object relations model. There's Adler's social model. There's Jung and spirituality and archetypes and the transpersonal, which enters principally, of course, through Jungian psychodynamic work, but is increasingly we're finding that also in psychoanalytic writing too. There is feminist therapy. So interesting that when I look at the feminist therapists, they are nearly all psychoanalytically trained. I don't find a feminist therapist streak very much in any of the other therapeutic models. When we look at the investigation of moral development, models of moral development, when we think about group analysis, when we think about the combination of cognitive analytic therapy which springs out of both traditions, and also when we think of the application of psychoanalytic ideas to sociology, to literary criticism, to the study of history, of biography, the study of film, theatre, and so on, we see the richness of these models, all of which forms a background to the work of any therapist. Then, the centrality of the therapeutic relationship. Now, some of these things, of course, we are also knocked for, and I'm no doubt we will be knocked for it as the day goes on. But I just want to draw attention here to three aspects which John Rowan and myself, coming from very different perspectives, nevertheless looking at the centrality of the therapeutic relationship, have drawn attention to. The instrumental relationship, the use of the instrumental self, the authentic self, and the transpersonal self. Now, I can't go into detail on this particular subject, but I just want to quote a very small part of the end of the book, where John and I are engaged in dialogue, and I say, I begin to wonder whether what we're describing in our three positions is something like this. First of all, the instrumental, that the therapist engages with the client through techniques, sometimes going as far as what Dave Mearns himself has called manualization. And through those techniques, and they are to some extent techniques, completely attends to the client, setting aside self-interest, setting aside that, but also setting aside, for the moment, self-reflection and the use of the self. So there's the instrumental position. There's the authentic position, that having done that, the therapist meets and engages with the client additionally through attending to, experiencing what is going on within the therapist, through self-reflection, monitoring his or her own feelings and thoughts, which in the psychodynamic tradition we refer to as countertransference, but that's just a term which is a convenient one to use. And then finally, the transpersonal, that the therapist engages with what is passing between or beyond the therapist and the client. In one way, not attending to anything, neither the self nor the client, but open to feelings and thoughts and experiences which appear to come from nowhere. And then reflects on those experiences, goes back into the authentic mode, the self-reflection, and then goes back into the instrumental in order to work out how best to put this to the client in the way that the client will be able to take it on board and understand it, if it is valuable. So what I'm trying to illustrate for you here is that centrality of the therapeutic relationship, which we are often in the psychodynamic tradition knocked for, is actually a false perception. Some other distinctive features. I think it's the relationship beyond the one-to-one, the relationship of the inner self, the inner world of the person, the relationship of the inner world to the external world, the relationship of the past to the present, the way in which the present influences the past, and the way we view the past, and the way we view the past influences the present. So that we're not always thinking about history and what actually happened. Who knows what actually happened in our lives? But what we're thinking about is that constant dynamic between past and present, which is, I think, very different from that caricature of psychodynamic work, that it's always having to dig around in the past in order to understand the present. We understand, by understanding the present sometimes, we understand people's perception of the past. Then there is the significance of the unconscious, and I know, because I've had a sneak preview of what Dave's going to say, that he's going to come back to this one. And I will come back to it if necessary too. But I want to say here that I've just finished working on a book with somebody on conscious and unconscious. That the notion of unconscious has gone through many different forms. But what is interesting is that having moved away, as we rightly should have done, from that sort of stupid notion that the unconscious is somewhere located in a part of the brain or even in a part of the body somewhere, the idea that there is within us so much more than we are ever aware of is absolutely vital to any therapeutic understanding of ourselves and of our clients. And it seems to me is absolutely vital for our understanding of what goes on in the world too. I wish that our politicians could understand a bit more about unconscious processes and not just about conscious processes as well. But when I think about the richness of this, I need to think about the concept of repression, of how much we hold back from viewing of ourselves. And I need to acknowledge too, although it's not particularly one that I go for, but I know other people do, Jung's notion of the collective unconscious, and particularly what I want to draw attention to is the unconscious meaning behind actions, words and symbols. And that takes me on to the next point about the relevance of words and symbols. Because it seems to me that one of the great features of the human being is our ability to use language. And our ability to use language means that we use language in very subtle ways. We use language which contains many layers of meaning. And we can only sometimes catch glimpses of that. We look at some of Freud's early work. He was drawing upon the richness of jokes, of the Freudian slip and so on. Essentially what needs to happen is that idea of looking at language is something that we want to help the client to look at and say, what do you think you're using those terms? What else might that mean? What else does that symbol mean, and so on? Now, of course, the caricature is that everything is standardized and that you can interpret symbols in particular ways and so on. But it's the richness of language and the multiple meanings of words, which means that beneath the surface, and by drawing it out, we begin to find that there are huge areas of feeling, thought, conception, images, ideas, which can come through in the occasional word, the dream, the symbol, and so on. And that, of course, leads me on naturally, too, to the way in which we not only use language, we are also cognitive beings. And the way in which, as a therapist, I think, I don't just feel, I'm not just into feeling with my client, but I'm into thinking about my client. I've already given some expression to the way in which that thinking goes on in relation to my thinking and my self-reflection in myself. Also the ability, of course, I hope to empty myself enough for thought to come into me from where I do not know. But nevertheless, the importance of thinking and the encouragement to the client also to think, because it is sometimes at points when one steps back from the emotion and begins to think that it is possible to cope with difficult experiences. That because there's some sense to why we are feeling the way we are feeling. Connections can be made and so on. Let's go on to the next one then. And this is the safety of the facilitating environment. This is, I think, one of the big contentious points that can often take place in the debate between the person-centered and the psychodynamic therapist. It's the one which can give rise, I think, to unfair criticism on both sides of others, often which comes, I think, from bad practice, rigidity of practice in the case of the psychodynamic, loose practice in the sense of person-centered. Nevertheless, it does seem to me that one of the strengths of the psychodynamic approach is the safety of the frame. What the frame, as it's called by Robert Langs. But let's interpret that frame in very different ways, because that's also the way in which psychodynamic practitioners, psychoanalytic practitioners, have interpreted the frame. If we take somebody like Robert Langs, American psychoanalyst, and communicative psychotherapy, the frame which is set up is inviolable, that the session must take place within a particular time, that there must be no intrusions within it, that it must be kept, as it were, as sterilized as possible from the outside world. But that's not my particular way of working, but although I can see the value, and I can see the value sometimes for people of having an absolutely clear structure around them that they know is there. But then we might also take the variance on this, and we might look at the work of Winnicott, for example, and the way that Winnicott, when working with deeply regressed patients in particular, was able to adapt the frame, and that Winnicott put forward the notion that the therapist must be to the patient as the mother is to the infant, constantly adaptive to the needs of the infant. Which doesn't mean that the infant dictates, but it also means that the infant influences the mother as to what is necessary. And that notion of the facilitating environment, and that's a Winnicott phrase, the facilitating environment, which has round it clear boundaries, but nevertheless has flexibility to it when necessary, is a very, very important part of a psychodynamic approach. And I know that there are people who can be criticised for being over-rigid on that. I do not want to defend them, except there are some instances, I'm sure, where that rigidity is also important for the client. And finally, I come on to the value of defences. That this was one of the aspects that Freud recognised very early on. That was that he could not make people say anything. And there were certain things that they did not want to acknowledge, either to him or even to themselves. And that they had the necessity of defences because they needed to defend themselves against what appeared to them to be awful ideas, experiences, thoughts, and so on. And that notion of slow, painstaking work, allowing people the space, the freedom to dismantle their own defences, but nevertheless the recognition always that the defences are there, seems to me to be another of the strengths of the psychodynamic approach. It is one which is so difficult, and I think both person-centred and psychodynamic therapies have found this difficult in relation to the necessity for short-term therapy. But it's one which is also very important there, the recognition that there is only a limited amount that can be done in the face of people's defences. The recognition that there will be a struggle within each one of us to try and understand ourselves, to experience some of the feelings which we hold back and so on. And the notion too that defences are there against extreme anxiety, the anxiety of what would happen if we allowed ourselves to feel, to think, to feel the unfeelable, to think the unthinkable.
You can certainly see why I said I was going to feel like a thorn amongst two roses now, can't you? And the heavyweights around this table. So I don't know who might like to start us off, if everyone has a question.
Stephen Messenger from Southampton. I was very interested, I work in the person-centred approach. I was very interested in your reference to Freud saying, so I got on board. Does that make sense?
Well, yes, it does. But in a way, what I suppose I was pointing out there was that what we had when Freud started his particular work was a dramatic shift in the way in which classical interviews with patients took place. And that's not the only example. I mean, there are many examples in Freud's early writing of the way in which he stopped doing things which medically, or even in terms of the hypnotic approach he was using, he stopped doing it because he recognized in one way or another it wasn't getting anywhere, or he was told by the client, stop asking me questions, just let me get on and talk. Now, having himself recognized that, one hopes that he went on doing that. In other words, it's a lesson that was learnt that was a permanent lesson. I have to say there are some examples in Freud where he clearly doesn't do that. And any of us can be in that position where we're so full of an idea ourselves that we push it on the client rather than waiting for it to emerge. But having developed that himself, also his followers do. So what we have there is actually a culture of listening, of accepting, of not judging, and all sorts of things, none of which actually are really written about in much depth. What we tend to have, we have very, very few papers written by Freud about what he actually recommends by way of technique, and even those papers are not accurate if you read the accounts by patients who were with him of what he was like. He was much more self-disclosing than he ever allowed people to be in the papers he wrote on it, and so on. So that tradition, I hope, has been built up. Now, of course, it has sometimes gone to the other extreme, and you might want to point to the silent therapist who never says anything, only listens. Then you're going the other way.
Another question, perhaps?
Can you say something about where your gut feeling is as to where the power lies?
To be quite honest, no, because it depends completely on who I'm working with. For instance, if I just take myself, who I'm working with. I may be working with some people who put me in a position of power, and I may be working with other people with whom I am very, very happy to relinquish nearly all that I'm doing except being there with them. So I can't actually answer that in a generalized way.
It's a sliding scale in your feeling in relation
Well,
to that person.
if you were asking me to put a theoretical position, it would be that there are different ways in which client and therapist have power. There are different ways in which they have power. The power of the client is to decide to come or not to come, to decide what to say or not what to say, to decide whether or not they want to respond to the therapist, and so on. The therapist has the power in saying, this is when we're going to meet. I mean, I hope these are negotiated, but this is the beginning of the session, this is the end of the session, and there's no giving on that because I've got somebody else coming in 10 minutes' time. There are questions around about power in relation to contracts, which may very well, in some situations, mean that the therapist has the power and not the client, because that's what the therapist's own contract is with the employing authorities, and so on. But the therapist has a certain power in having a greater knowledge, I suspect, of the general issues that are brought to therapy than the client does. But the client has the greater knowledge of herself or himself. So it's a whole mixture. It is right. In a way it's on a scale, but actually it isn't. It's more complex than being on a single linear scale. Well, I come back to dynamics. Dynamic. The whole thing is always flexible, moving. You know, we're sort of inside a balloon pushing backwards, or inside the womb, or wherever we are. Anyway.
Thank you, Michael. And now Dave Mearns will put the same case, but for person-centred therapy.
Around about 1996, I became totally and completely frustrated with what I've come to call the superficiality myth around person-centred therapy. For the umpteenth time, I had heard a psychodynamicist, I'm not sure if I get the term right, but something like that, say, oh, well, person-centred therapy, yes, that emphasises the relationship, and so do we, and every other therapy, and we all do that, and then we go on and we do the real work, you know. In other words, the person-centred therapy being represented as something relatively superficial. I was fed up with this for the last time, but I decided to do something a bit more constructive with my fed-upness. I started to read the kind of literature that people from another approach would read about person-centred therapy, which is kind of an interesting thing to do. And then I understood how they got their quite reasonable conclusion. Because most of the literature that is kind of written for more general reading is the odd chapter in a textbook. Or even, and I say this against myself, even person-centred counselling in action, to some extent, doesn't give the quality and the fullness and the depth of the therapeutic relationship and the therapeutic working in person-centred therapy, and certainly chapters in general textbooks don't. They almost always go into the therapeutic conditions. As soon as we break person-centred therapy relationship into the therapeutic conditions, we've lost a lot of its quality, actually, and we've certainly lost a lot of its relational depth. So from 1996, I began a kind of campaign to try and describe my experience of doing person-centred therapy, because I experienced it as enormously taxing, incredibly deep in terms of its demands on myself, and a hugely intellectual as well as emotional pursuit. And I tried to describe that and publish some papers on things like relational depth and configuration theory. Tried to publish them initially in things like counselling and things that had a big circulation of about 20,000. So in a sense, this is part of that, is really trying to explain what this approach is to me, because it's certainly not superficial. To go into some of the distinctive features of person-centred therapy, first and foremost, I would say that the phenomenological emphasis of person-centred therapy distinguishes it, I think, from virtually every approach, although not from every therapist. We will have a number of therapists working in all sorts of different traditions who take an equally strong phenomenological stance, but theoretically at least it tends to distinguish it. This is a very serious emphasis on focusing the work on the experiencing of the client, of the reality of the client, and of working within that world, of working within the world as it is experienced by the client, rather than from some kind of outside frame. Now, that way of working fits incredibly uneasily with the medical model. Actually, one of my hypotheses here, and I think it's shared by Michael, is that by the end of the day we'll realise that both our approaches fit rather uneasily with the medical model and might do well to combine our efforts, but that's for later. One of the interesting things about person-centred therapy is that it's an incredibly popular approach among clients, and I think it's this phenomenological emphasis that really does that they really feel they're being met in their ground, inside their self, in their terms, in their reality. A core concept of person-centred therapy is the actualising process. Now, Rogers talked about the actualising tendency, which in fact is a very simple concept, which is incredibly misunderstood, usually by people not inside the approach. It's amazing how such a simple notion can be so misunderstood. From very early on, I think it was misrepresented as a kind of over-optimistic, very positive view of human nature, that each human being, should have within them a basic actualizing tendency, a basic tendency to do the best they could in whatever circumstances they found themselves. That's what the actualizing tendency is. A basic tendency to maintain the self, to develop the self, to enhance the self. I always say to do the best job we can in whatever circumstances we are. And that's really all the actualizing tendency is. It's not a positive concept. It's a very basic, fundamental kind of growth concept. There are many examples I can give you, and you wouldn't call them positive. There are many examples where the circumstances in which the person finds themselves, that the only way they can survive, the only way they can maintain, and the only way they can develop is to kill or to abuse. Now, that may seem amazing and not to fit the frame at all of Rogers' so-called very positive concept, but it is a concept which is neither positive nor negative in terms of values. It's a basic concept about human living, that fundamental to that is the inclination to survive and also to develop and enhance and, in a sense, do the best job. I've, in recent terms, slightly developed Rogers' concept of the actualizing tendency to see it as actually part of a process concept, which I call the actualizing process. Rogers, writing in his day 50 years ago, wrote in a kind of unitary style of theory that was appropriate for its time. I call it a John Wayne period in terms of theory. You know, things are either good or bad and that's it. Whereas now we can cope with much more dialogical process concepts. Although Rogers was actually a pioneer of process concepts in the early days, lost it a bit in California phase. But the actualizing process emphasizes, yes, there's a growth tendency. Yes, that's basic, that's fundamental, wouldn't change that concept at all of Rogers. But also as a part of living, as a part of engagement, the actualizing tendency inspires its own resistance within the person. And that resistance is very much related to the person's concept of their social context, or as Kurt Lewin called it, social life space. So that's a concept which we could go on at much depth with. It's a rich concept, that actualizing process. And it's very much about balancing. That the human being, if you actually watch how they go about their life, they are not going just for growth. You don't see that. You also see restraining kind of tendencies. And the restraining tendencies help the growth overall. They help maintain the life context. And if the restraining tendencies become too strong, we're inhibited. And if the growth urge goes on without any kind of backstop, the person can end up also in a very disturbed state. In terms of disorder in this model, in Carl Rogers' latter theory, disorder was a restraining of the actualizing tendency. I don't see that as disorder at all. Disorder for me is a failure to be able to rebalance the actualizing process, a getting stuck in the actualizing process and not being able to rebalance. All that stuff is quite theoretical and published in places. For my purposes here, I'm kind of going through the headings. A fundamental concept in person-centered therapy is offering the client a meeting at relational depth. I don't tend to use the so-called therapeutic conditions, empathy, unconditional positive regard, congruence. I'm trying to put them back together again. Rogers split them up for the purposes of research, which was understandable. That was a very important emphasis 50 years ago. In splitting up any gestalt, you can lose a lot. And so maybe an employee of mine comes and says, counsellor comes and says, or applies for one of my jobs and says, well, I'm good on empathy. Now, my unconditional positive regard's pretty good with most clients, but, you know, there's some, of course, and my congruence is kind of coming along, you know. So I might say to them, well, get a job with somebody else, you know. I'm not interested in partiality. I'm wanting someone who can offer a meeting at full relational depth with every single person who comes through the door, every single person. And that, of course, is an incredible challenge. And that challenges the depth of the counsellor. And boy, does that challenge training, and does that challenge personal development and training. It makes personal development not something that we divest to personal therapy, something that comes right into the training. The meeting at relational depth, sometimes this is, again, sort of misunderstood in a superficial way from people in other approaches usually, as something like, what's the sort of phrase that's often used for it? A therapeutic alliance. You know, it's a hell of a lot more than a therapeutic alliance. A therapeutic alliance gets us communicating, gets a basic level of trust. And engagement at relational depth means the client is accepting us in to parts of themselves that they're scared to be there themselves, and they never let anyone in. They often don't let themselves in. And engagement at relational depth is much deeper than transferential relating. In fact, transference doesn't exist when people meet at relational depth. Often it's gone through as part of the process, and sometimes clients come back up through it when they're disengaging from relational depth. And I remember if I get a client, a young man who, with horror, said to me, "My God, did I say all those things to an old man like you?" That's something we can go into later. I'll certainly bring up transference later. But what I'm talking about in terms of relational depth is a powerful engagement which is on offer, and of course which clients will often be very uncertain about and have often an approach avoidance relationship with it, you know, because often they've been very damaged in relationships. And so part of the real difficulty, part of the whole therapy can be the process of getting that engagement or getting towards that engagement. In my own internship as a therapist, I worked in a Veterans Administration hospital with severely traumatized and often mute war veterans. And getting the engagement, getting the relational engagement was probably 9/10 of the actual therapy, in fact, because that was a therapy in itself, although that's not always the case. Engaging at relational depth often gives us access to what I call the client's existential process. I did mention it in the sense it gives us access to their own world of experiencing, and that's where most of the work takes place. This isn't to say, by the way, they're constantly relational depth. We're in and out of it. We'll vary. What the client needs to know is that we are able and willing to meet them there and work with them in their existential process. I could go into a lot more detail, but I don't need to. An interesting aspect of modern person-centred therapy is the attention to what we call difficult processes. This is a term first coined by Margaret Warner, and she herself has done a lot of work in describing fragile process and dissociative process. Michael reminded me of this earlier, there is a lot of similarities between her way of conceiving the work and D.W. Winnicott. Very interesting. And working with very similar populations too, of severely troubled people. I'm not going into detail on the nature of these processes. There's others too. Gary Prouty's psychotic process. Another process that we're just becoming interested in, Elke Lambers, who's here, coined the term once as a working term, dead process. It's a working term. It's too emotive, I think. But sometimes we work with clients and it actually seems like their process is dead. It's probably not, but that's how it seems. And we're playing around with that idea. And Elke and myself, and also Mick Cooper, who's joined us from Brighton, who trained here actually as an existential therapist. We're working on areas like that. Self-pluralism in person-centred therapy. Sometimes when we work with the client inside their existential process, it's like we've gained invited access inside their self. And they'll begin to look at their self more from an inside perspective than an outside one. If we were to look at this building from the outside, we would describe its architecture and whatever. If we come inside, we describe its different rooms and corridors. And sometimes from that inside perspective, clients talk in terms of parts of their self. Not always, but sometimes. This notion of self-pluralism exists in many, many different approaches. Indeed, it's fascinating how very different approaches have, in the last 20 years, come upon this notion. And what we've been doing recently is developing a language and theory of that for a person-centred frame. And we're very careful not to take the theory too far. You can take the theory of configurations. I'm not going to take it much beyond where I've got it, because if you take it too far, it has a compelling nature, and the theory can begin to take over from the person that you're meeting. If we've got enough theory to be able to kind of inspire our imagination so that we can hear the variety of things our clients are giving us, then that for me is enough theory. Thereafter, the theory is evolved at the individual level, and each new client gives a new theory. That's phenomenological working. It's interesting that in very modern times, we're talking more about a family of person-centred therapies. And that's comprised of a lot of different. That's comprised the original Chicago school, who are kind of pretty strict in terms of non-directivity. The California school, who aren't strict about anything. I'm allowed to say that because that's where I train. But I've kind of rebelled a bit. We talk about process experiential group, talk about focusing oriented, people who have all started within person-centred, gone out and developed it in different ways and are actually kind of coming back to become part of the family of the approach, and in very recent times started the New International Journal of the World Association. And that's kind of an interesting thing, because often in approaches things just break up, but it's very interesting to see them come together again. That might be really creative. Okay, that's fine.
Thank you, Dave. Well, thank you very much for that, and I kind of want to open up the questions really and see who might have a question for Dave.
This uses the word technique very much. I wonder if it was a word that...
Yes, just to repeat it, the question is, I don't hear person-centred therapists use the word technique very often, and that's probably symptomatic of what I'm saying, that we would be very uninclined to go in with the particular ways of working. Let me make a difference though, a distinction between what we might call process direction and product direction. You'll find within the family of person-centred therapists some people who would be okay about making a process direction, about saying to the client, how about what would happen if, consider this for a moment, and what about this, and that kind of thing. Inviting the client, even empathy is an implicit process direction. It asks the question. So therapists would vary in their inclination to that, but very few person-centered therapists would make a product direction, would actually direct a client towards a particular analysis or a particular interpretation or whatever. And also too, I know that would vary in other traditions as well, but that would be rare.
The nature of personality of those who choose particular models
Yes.
to work in.
Yeah. I think this is really important because I absolutely firmly believe, I've said it for years, that there is not a difference in effectiveness among the different approaches. What I think is one of the crucial variables is finding an approach that fits you as a person. I think that's really important. I remember as a young psychologist doing behavioural treatments, and I was terrible at them. I really was bad. I was bad because I was kind of sloppy, you know, and you can't be sloppy in that. And I was so bad. Now that didn't mean that behavioural approaches were bad. It meant it was a bad fit for me. And even now sometimes we get people applying for a training, and in the course of the interview they'll say, this is a psychodynamicist, you know, that's the value, and you can see the eyes opening wide, and so we sort of suggest, well, there's this other training that you might find better, you know. And I think that's really important, that people find a fit for them in terms of their working.
The commonality would then be the release of the use of self.
I think that's what can happen. If a person has got a fit, then they can do that, then it's easier for them, I think, to follow the client, actually. It's easier for them to be informed and feel free enough. When they're defensive, they'll often follow the model. Fascinating piece of research that's been repeated across 40 years, you know, suggesting that experienced workers in different traditions are very close together, and inexperienced workers are quite far apart. And I think it's that confidence and whatever.
We've heard from both parties now, if you like, an overview of their own theoretical way of working. And now what we're going to do is to listen to both of them criticise each other's school of and way of working. So we'll start off with Dave Meehan, who's going to present the criticisms of psychodynamic theory from a person-centred perspective.
Okay, here we go. It's actually something I've never done before in public. And I've never done it because I find that people from another approach understand the approach they're criticising so poorly that they don't make good critics. The best critics are critics from within your own approach. And so my criticism is likely to reflect my own superficial understanding. Also, too, I'm going to be a bit naughty. There's quite a lot of the criticism I'm going to level that actually I don't feel very personally, but it's common criticism from in the person-centred tradition towards it. I think a lot of the criticism that we'll find, I imagine this will happen both ways, has actually got more to do with prejudice than anything else. Never mind, I'm not going to spoil this with too many caveats. Let's batter on. How about transference? Is transference the core of therapy, or is it... I noticed Michael didn't mention it at all. Maybe he thought it was dangerous ground. Is transference the core of therapy, or, as I would say, a superficial interfering process in therapy? The idea that a therapeutic approach, and I know it doesn't apply to the whole of the psychodynamic tradition, but it applies to a lot of it, the idea that a therapeutic approach should actually see its raison d'etre as restricted to such a superficial level of relating is quite amazing from a person-centred perspective. From a person-centred perspective, transference in a relationship is it's a superficial interfering process to be got through in order to engage at relational depth and to enter the client's existential process. It's at its extremes, and transference process can be quite extreme. It becomes a part of what we call fragile process, and it's quite interesting to read about Margaret Warner's work in that concern. And the idea that that we could devote too much time and energy, and here I'm maybe talking more about classical psychoanalysis here, and I acknowledge that, Michael, but it's kind of the part that's become very public for person-centred view. The idea that we should do things like seeking to develop the transference, it's not just bizarre. From a person-centred perspective, it might even be argued as unethical, because you're actually trying to encourage a process that is certainly going to elongate the therapeutic process. In the person-centred frame, we're trying to become aware of elements and dimensions of transference as they exist, and the awareness of them, and the clashing of the client's transferential expectations with the reality of the therapist, which isn't being masked. The clashing of that helps us go through it. If we make the therapist put on a mask so that they give a blank screen on which the transference bounces back and is enhanced and whatever, wow, that's going to elongate the therapy by a factor of 10 or 20. I mean, it really is going to elongate the therapy. It's difficult enough to get through transference process to a level of engagement to reach the client's existential process. If we actually seek to emphasize it and increase it, well, the client better leave an open checkbook, you know, and organizations employing people working in that way certainly better not have time limits under a couple of years. The term transference abuse, so in a way I'm intentionally misusing this term. Mike and I both know the use of that term accurately in psychodynamic tradition, and I'm kind of provocatively extending it and saying, you know, we might equally call the encouragement of transference as an abuse.
First of all, just go back historically, that transference was coined as a term because it was that very feature which you have yourself described, I think, as negative process, and that was that the way in which a particular patient reacted negatively towards Freud made him think about the notion of the transference, and the nature of the negative reaction was an intense idealization of Freud, which of course is a negative transference. What he believed was necessary, and I think what we all believe is necessary, is that there should be a good positive relationship between therapist and client, and that that's called a positive transference, but you don't bother to talk about that. You just you are glad that it's there and you accept it. But where there is negative transference, in other words, there's something that's getting between you and your client, and in the term transference is used by psychodynamic to refer to the client's difficulty, whereas the therapist's difficulty is referred to as countertransference. So there's a recognition on both sides that those can occur. Then that needs to be looked at in order for the work to progress. Now, you are quite right, of course, to suggest that that has led to two errors. And I think the first error is the one that I would want to completely back you up on, Dave, and that is to artificially create bad feelings in order, what's called the frustration model. In other words, you present a very frustrating picture, and I've seen people do this in groups particularly, and then you get the heat going, of course. The more you frustrate them, the more the heat comes out, the more the aggression comes out, and how good that is for everybody. I don't think it necessarily actually leads to unlimited therapy. I think it can happen in short-term work too. I don't actually think that has to be done. I think if you're sensitive enough to what's going on inside the inner world of your client, there will be plenty of things there that will come out, and they don't need to be brought out artificially at all. And indeed, to bring them out artificially is wrong. The second thing I think that you drawn attention to is the blank screen. And personally, I don't favour that approach either. And I think most psychodynamic therapists, most of them that I know, see people facing them. Chairs are facing each other, so that there is no sense in which you can have a blank screen if you can be seen, your face can be seen, your body movements can be seen, and so on, because we give everything away in that. But the notion that you therefore have to present a blank screen in order for a person to be able to create that projection onto you, again, I think is one that is unnecessary. People will do that whether or not, however you are. If someone needs to project something on you, they'll project it onto you. The skill is in being able to see that it's happening. And I suppose the only virtue to the blank screen is that you artificially create a situation in which it's much easier to see it happening, but you may well be creating it's happening in the first place, of course, by being so withholding. So I want to go along with that. But the other notion, you see, that's very important here, and I think it's a total misunderstanding of psychodynamic position, is that the transference is core. That's not true at all. I could just give you just a little example from a client some years back, who said to me, "You know, there's a little bit of me that sees you as my father." Now that's transference. But wasn't that beautifully expressed? There's a little bit of me that sees you as a father. I know the rest of me doesn't. We're exactly the same age. You're nowhere near looking like my father, but there's a bit of me that does. And the reason that we needed to say, what's that about? And the reason was that we were coming up to a longish break. And this person's father had been such a significant figure to her in her childhood that when he went away for breaks, not for breaks because he was being called up in the war and so on, that was devastating. And so the little bit of her was worried about what the break would be in case she wouldn't be able to hold. Now that's what transference is. It's not that I was the father, full stop. And I think that's often the misapprehension about the term. I mean, I don't think I really, I think you've addressed this, but I had already thought of it. And this comes from, I think, an author on the person-centered experiential side called Watson et al. Describing the little bit of contact between therapist and client. Therapist: "It seems to me something's changed about 5 sessions ago between us. We've had a hard time getting back on track. Feels like you're angry with me about something." "No, I'm not angry," says the client. "It's just that this isn't working." Therapist: "You know, we've been exploring how you retreat in your relationship with your partner when you feel hurt and you can't get what you want. I wonder if in exploring that you felt hurt by me, like I'm saying that the relationship difficulties are all your fault." Client: "Yes, well, now you say it like that, I have been feeling you don't really see what I have to put up with and somehow it becomes all my fault." Therapist: "Well, that's painful. I guess that's like your mother always seeing you as the one who was responsible when you and your sister fought. That would make it difficult to feel confident about being open here." Now that, I presume, is negative process. That's what I call negative transference. That's the sort of thing that we are, I think, in common working on.
Who needs analysis? Is it the client or the analyst? I'm going to pick a little bit from a paper that's getting published soon for myself. Another area of difference between person-centered and psychodynamic would certainly be a criticism of psychodynamic therapy from a person-centered frame is the tendency for psychodynamic workers to need to analyse their clients from an external theoretical frame. Person-centered reactions to this vary from incredulity to mocking at the seriousness which psychodynamic workers can attach to their analyses. If person-centered workers were also to take an analytical frame in relation to such analytical behaviour, we would probably see it in terms of the therapist's need to feel some degree of power in relation to their client. One of the most frustrating things is working alongside traditional psychodynamic therapists. They have an incredible tendency to carry their need to analyse into other settings, where it is highly inappropriate. Third parties are often analysed as part of a seeming game, which appears to carry the payoff of helping the psychodynamic therapist to feel suitably smug and superior in relation to their analysand. Person-centred therapists are not inclined to join in that game and can only watch it from the side with incredulity. That's the kind of thing that kind of gets up our noses, you know. Maybe it's just because we don't understand it, or maybe what we are seeing, and I do think we might come back to this in the end, is examples of sometimes bad practice or extreme practice or whatever, and I do accept that. But I think it's important we get these things out in the air, you know. If we want to come together more, which is my aim in this whole thing, we've got to get this stuff out. Oh yeah, let me actually, staying kind of on this, this business of analysing and things like that. This appeared in December's CPJ Counselling Psychotherapy Journal. And I think this is the most incredible gobbledygook I've ever heard in my life. Let's look at this from a person-centred frame. This is a poor therapist, I presume a psychodynamic therapist, or it would be terrible. And goodness knows why this sanction's been applied to her by British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy. And I've taken this from a bigger thing, but this was the essence of it. Ms. X was required to produce a written submission analysing what happened on a conscious and unconscious level between herself and her client. The submission must include a written reflection of the learning from this, uncovering, etc., etc. Now, that may make perfect sense to someone from the psychodynamic tradition. That's weird. That would make no sense to anyone outside that frame. Poor woman's got to analyse what happened between her and the client on a conscious, fair enough, level. Well, she can talk about her conscious level. Has she got sufficient contact with her client to be able to infer about her client's conscious level? Maybe. She certainly can't talk about her unconscious level by definition. She can't know it. And my God, can she talk about her client's unconscious level? She can't know her own. She certainly can't know that. You know, this is craziness. And this is appearing as a formal sanction by a professional association on a therapist. And I believe she did it because it was also published that she'd done it satisfactorily.
You talk about the who needs analysis, the client or the analyst, and having to analyse things and so on. Let me just give you a quote. I mean, we could all comb the literature to find good quotes, but I think this is a good one. This is a good one. This is in Judy Cooper's book on Masood Khan. Thus, the main aim of analysis becomes not so much to insist that the patient obeys the fundamental rule and then to interpret the resistances to this. That's the fundamental rule is I want you to speak everything that comes into your mind. But for the analyst to provide a setting in which the patient can safely regress in the company of an other whose presence they can register, to discover his way in the world of objects, as Balint writes, and not be shown the right way by some profound or correct interpretation. Or, as Masood Khan writes, through a psychic, affective and environmental holding of the person, of the patient, in the clinical situation, I facilitate certain experiences that I cannot anticipate or program any more than the patient can. When these actualize, they are surprising both for the patient and for me, and they release quite unexpected new processes in the patient. Now, there has been, I think, a fundamental shift from the old days when it was necessary, or it was felt necessary, to encourage the transference and to make transference interpretations, through to a situation where it is providing the right environment for a person to be able to be surprised by what comes up in the relationship between the therapist and the client, some of which will be transference material in as much as it has been transferred from other relationships onto the client. Other material will be very much to do with the therapist-client relationship, for which there may be some parallels elsewhere, but it starts with the therapist-client relationship, and I shall return to that this afternoon when I look at some of the criticisms that I would want to make of person-centred therapy. You refer, of course, to that conscious and unconscious remark, and I want to say that I agree with you, though I think you're also implying that if you were psychodynamic, you'd know what that jargon meant. What essentially it meant to me was that we would want that particular person to look at what obviously happened between her and the client, at least as she perceives it, because she can't ask the client, but we would also ask her to look with her supervisor, I would imagine, at what else might have been happening that you weren't aware of at the time, that you were not conscious of at the time. Now that seems to me to be a perfectly plain way of speaking, and I think we use this jargon, you use jargon, we use jargon, we need to interpret to each other.
I wonder what psychodynamic training does. Does it create a congruent therapist, or, well, maybe you're not wanting to. I would have thought you would be. Or is it about honing defences? Because I tell you, people coming out to psychodynamic training often look really funny, you know. I mean, I mean, I say in my notes here, it's fascinating to see the difference in people once they undergo an analytic training. Often they virtually disappear as people and come out the other end as incredibly well-defended operatives, appearing so similar to each other that they look like clones. The suspicion is that the effect of the training is not one of helping them to discover their personal defences and work through them, but it actually is the result of helping them to hone those defences in order to remain even more securely hidden. Okay, there's some criticisms, and I'm sure many other people would level others. I know I've been a bit provocative.
It is now Michael Jacobs' turn to place his criticisms against person-centred therapy.
I think one of the difficulties in this setting is that each of us is having to say things about the other which we know actually is not completely true about the other person. But it is nevertheless the impression that, at least if I can speak for myself, the impression that I have from speaking or listening to some people who are trained as person-centred therapists. And I have to say also, we have the advantage that Brian Thorne has produced a video, actually more than one video of his work. I don't know whether Dave has or not, but I have seen some of Brian's work, and he has written very honestly about his work too. And so some impressions are sometimes confirmed by seeing them in practice. Right, it's fine on technique, but not on theory. Now, there was a question over there used the word technique, and I have to say I would be sympathetic to saying that I don't like the word technique either for psychodynamic work. But I think nonetheless one has to recognise that each therapeutic system does have a technique. What you hope in the end is that the technique becomes so hidden and becomes part of you that it's no longer being a technique. But you have to learn to drive a car, for example, and then eventually you begin to drive a car without thinking two hoots about what you're doing. And that's always seemed to me to be the analogy to learning about how to listen, how to respond, how to ask open-ended questions, and so on. So these are techniques, though they should become, in the end, very natural. Now, they're techniques which psychodynamic people use as well as person-centred work we use. The essential core conditions, then, fine, but it always seems to me, and I have to say that Dave is the exception, and you've had a hint or two this morning already listening to him, but that if I want to look at theoretical aspects about the structure of the personality, the nature of personal development, and so on, I don't find that, and I don't hear it being spoken about very much either. So while I appreciate and fully concur with the notion that if you provide the right conditions, then a person can grow, that the self-actualizing process can begin and continue, it seems to me it's like, to use an analogy, of saying that you need to have a good greenhouse for providing plants which has light and warmth and so on, but without any recognition about the fact that you need to know about the diseases that can attack plants and all the other things that can go wrong. So I don't find that, personally, very satisfactory, because it doesn't give me enough of a handle on how I might understand what the client is talking about, not just in terms of their experience, but in terms of how that experience relates to other parts of their experience, to their history, and so on. So that's the first of my criticisms. The second is that I believe that the core conditions are necessary, but unlike the person-centred approach, I think they're insufficient. Well, I have to qualify that straight away, actually, because with some clients they are absolutely sufficient, of course. But with other clients they are not sufficient. And my experience has been that I have found quite a number of people coming for training on a psychodynamic course who've done a person-centered course and say that they've reached a point where they need to learn more and they can't find it on the person-centered course. So they come to the psychodynamic one. And indeed, they find that their whole world as a therapist opens up. Now, I am only reporting what people tell me. It may be a weakness to do with the person-centered training that they have in the particular area in which I was working at the time. But that's certainly been my impression. And I've only come across, I have to say, one person who has gone the other way, trained as psychodynamic, and then gave that up, and then went into the person-centered and was fully into person-centered. Because it seems to me that the person-centered is what is basic to all the work that I do. So I have no worry about it, in a way, though I've got some of the worries I'm going to be telling you, of course, but in a way I have no worry about it at all. But I need more than that in order for it to become sufficient for me to understand the dimensions, the subtleties, the complexities of the ongoing therapy and the different aspects of the therapeutic relationship.
You were addressing a number of issues about theory, fine on technique, thin on theory, necessary but insufficient. And I presumed when I saw your notes you were meaning the client, insufficient for the client, but you kept talking about the therapist. And that's a kind of interesting hypothesis. That if you want to be a really smart person, or at least to look a really smart person, stay a mile away from person-centered therapy. You know, 'cause it's not so great, it's not a great medium for really looking smart. Go to psychodynamic or something like that, or Gestalt, or something where you can really operate and be seen to be operating, be seen to be a smart operator. It's not a good orchestration. And if people are training person-centered and not getting enough orchestration for being powerful, for being smart, then there's plenty others that can do that. I have seen a number of students who have moved in the other direction. I think that's right. You would see more of them moving one way and I would see more of them the other. And it's a different exercise. Often what they've got to go through is a period, I was going to say of unlearning, but that's not really true. It's not a period of unlearning. It's although they often express it that way, it's more a period of learning some restraint over their input and knowing that that they may have a nice connection, they may have a nice interpretation, but what happens if I just pause on this a bit? What happens if I pay more attention to the edge of the client's awareness and where they're at? And if I can kind of meet them there, what happens then? And quite often, not always, but quite often what happens there is that the client can lead you, not necessarily to where you are, but to somewhere productive. And that's another thing, the danger in forming those interpretations, the danger in forming those connections, is that who you can become the figure and the client becomes the ground, and we can miss so much then if what we're focusing on is the connection or the theory that's figure for us. In terms of fine on technique, thin on theory, I remember once in a book, I can't remember which one, but I think it was Person-Centered Counselling in Action, right in the first chapter, Brian, and I said person-centered counselling kind of runs thin on theory or something like that. And we regretted saying that because it actually wasn't accurate. And we changed it for the second edition. But there's a very well-developed theory of therapy, I think as well-developed as anywhere, and also particularly well-researched. I think better researched than in any model except, I think, cognitive behavioural. But the theory of the person is much less well developed than in psychodynamic approaches, and intentionally so. We could do more. I think we could do more, particularly in the areas which other people would frame as psychopathology and have categories for, and we are doing more in that direction. I think we can do more. But it's very important not to do so much work on the theory of the person that the theory becomes the God, in a sense, and we become the tool, or even worse, the theory becomes the God and the patient becomes the tool, intentionally chosen word. Theory, in terms of the person-centered approach, has exceeded its value if it defines, if it dictates, if it in any way paints the picture of the client. Theory is really good up to that point. Theory is good, as I mentioned earlier, it expands our own awareness, expands our own awareness of possibilities. So, for example, in my own specialty, which historically was working with severely traumatized young men, there was a lot of theory developed at that time, and more so even since. You knew a lot about trauma and the way it sometimes could manifest itself. For instance, I'll give you a tiny example. In working with people who were veterans in war, one of the really difficult things was the buzz that they maybe got from that experience. In my experience, about a third of patients, because it was a hospital, a third of patients showed that. The buzz is that simultaneously you're in a situation which was the most horrible you've ever been in your life, and simultaneously you never felt more alive. And that's a powerful buzz that can sometimes happen in trauma. Now, it was really good to know about that, to know that bit of theory, if you like. Really good to know that, because if your patient really began to symbolize that, began to speak about that, it was a very difficult thing to address, because the amount of guilt would often block it. If they began to symbolize and express that, you knew the ball game you were in. You knew the kind of area they were talking about. You didn't know the specifics. You had to hear that from them. So that helped. It helped expand your awareness, expand your imagination. The worst use of that, of course, would be to expect your patients to show that. And that's where theory can get into the wrong order. Whereas you're waiting for that from your patients and sometimes inadvertently feeding it, which I've done before many times, and it can be very dangerous with very vulnerable clients. So the skill in using theory in the person-centered approach, I think, is an important one. Having said that, I do think that we have a theory deficit, particularly in the area where others would use the word psychopathology. I'm reluctant to use that word because I think I would approach it in a more Lingian way, actually. And I think that's an area that we are gradually developing, but from an entirely different base. Margaret Warner's work on fragile and dissociative process. I mentioned Gary Prouty's on dissociative process. Prouty and many others are working with people with profound learning difficulties, and some more that's coming on the scene. And indeed a lot of work in Holland, where a person-centered approach is very prominent in mental health. So that theory deficit, I think, is gradually being addressed. But it's that balance of theory, that the usefulness of theory in terms of the therapist, so that it opens rather than closes things. And I think we could apply that to almost any area.
Sometimes to say you think something is felt to be infra-dig, but to feel it is actually okay. I have said earlier that I think it's one of the strengths of the psychodynamic approach, that it appeals also to the thinking part of me, and I would like to see much more expression of that. But again, I have to say, I'm already hear that. You see, when Dave speaks about some of the cutting-edge work that he's involved with, there is somebody who's really thinking about things. But it's not the impression one gets from working with, speaking with many of the person-centered counsellors who are around, unless they have begun to pick up and use some of the other language that's around. I mean, a very interesting example of that, of course, is the term parallel process, which is a psychodynamic term, a psychoanalytic term, but which actually has come into many other therapies. So there's some sort of process of osmosis, but it's not there, it seems to me, at the base.
Feeling at the expense of the cognitive. In 1984, in the first edition of Individual Therapy in Britain, I think it was called, one of Wendy Dryden's first books, one of the first of 130, I think. A person from each tradition was writing a chapter on their tradition, and Brian Thorne wrote the person-centered chapter. Now, Wendy asked all the authors to do some things in common, and one of the things he said was, I want you to label your therapy. Is it more for the affective or more for the cognitive, or both? You know, where does it stand on that? And Brian figured it both equally. And Wendy thought he'd made a mistake. You know, Wendy literally thought he'd put his ticks in the wrong boxes and got back to him on it. And Brian, I think absolutely accurately, said, we are as much about thinking and feeling. We're about all the things that are making up the person. We spend our time as much on thinking and feeling, and they're both intermingled. You can't work with the whole person unless you're equally into them. I very much agree with Michael's point that often we use the word feeling when accurately it's thinking. I personally often think that's a kind of defensive thing. If I say it's a feeling, then it's more difficult for you to challenge me. If I say it's a thought, you can challenge me. And I think person-centred are particularly skillful at making that mistake. I certainly hear it a lot anyway, so I do very much agree with that.
Blinkered positive view of human nature. Of course, I'm overstating the case, but actually I think it's true. I have to say that basically I don't think we change very much. I think what happens is that we adapt. We learn to adapt, but we don't change our basic natures. Where those natures have come from, or whether they are inborn, genetic, environmental, nature, nurture, is a big debate. But I don't think the basic nature changes. I think I learn to live with myself. And I go along fully in the end with Freud, that you take away the veneer of civilization and people are disgusting the way they treat each other. That seems to me to be endemic to the human race. It's not there on the whole in the animal species. And so that blinkered positive view of human nature worries me. And it worries me for this reason, that I think that person-centred therapists are weak on working with negative feelings, particularly negative feelings towards the therapist.
A blinkered positive view of human nature. I have difficulty with this. Can we talk about evil? I don't know if this helps, but I define evil in person-centred therapy today. I say evil exists under two conditions apply. Evil exists when the person using the word evil does not understand what's going on, does not understand another person, and also when they're scared of that other person or what they don't understand. If I don't understand this other person and I'm fearful of them, those are the conditions in which we tend to attribute the word evil. In other words, I see evil as nothing more than a term which one person attributes to another. I think it's quite a frightening thing to have the term attributed to you, and I've had it attributed to me many times on the basis of things I've written in books. It's a very easy word for other people to use. I actually don't therefore believe in evil except as a term attributed by one person towards another. Brian Thorne and I differ on that point, by the way. I think people will often use words like that, or that this is coming from the darker side, or whatever it is, almost racist comments nowadays, but they'll often use that, and it's usually about things they don't understand and are a bit fearful of. So for instance, if I'm working with like client Bobby in there, one of the clients I worked with, I say a lot about him in that book. Bobby had been a Glasgow gangster. A lot of the stuff that he had done was readily described as evil by most people. And if you only met Bobby in that superficial way, or if you read his crime record or some of the press about him, happily used the word evil and the darker side, and when the veneer of civilization is taken away, we get animals like that, or worse than animals, they're not like animals. However, as soon as you begin to, for instance, get little bits of understanding of Bobby, just even little bits, then you find yourself quite totally changing in terms of your orientation. Not that you're seeing him as some lovable character, because he certainly isn't, but you can maybe begin to understand, for instance, you know, some of the ways he had to defend himself against the physical abuse of his father, you know, and how, if you're to survive in that world, one of the things Bobby did was he really closed himself off to anybody else, and that was really safety. But furthermore than that, he found out that to keep himself really safe, he had to operate preemptively in relation to others, and that often led to his physical mutilation of others and all sorts of criminal behaviour. So you got these glimpses, and even after only one or two glimpses, you really didn't need at all to dismiss him. And also, you wouldn't talk about him as a loving character or anything like that. You'd be very wary in all sorts of ways, but you wouldn't sort of see him in any way as fundamentally bad. I'm not sure if I'm describing this really well, but it's like that contact with people, or those glimpses of a person, I think they make you less needing to use words like good and bad. I think that's really what I'm saying. So Rogers would say in his theory, and I wouldn't differ at all, would say that in terms of the human being, they don't start off good or bad. They don't start off either way, good or bad. These are words civilization puts onto them, or whatever. They start off simply as beings that are doing their best to survive, to develop, to enhance, to whatever. They could find themselves in one context, and that survival could lead to other people calling them evil. They could lead to, in another context, they would be defined as saints. Windy Dryden's got a wonderful thing on Hitler and Mother Teresa in one of the lectures he gave, one of Windy Dryden's published lectures, in which he reproduces all sorts of things about Hitler, all sorts of positive things, and all sorts of negative things about Mother Teresa. It's a wonderful thing to use with students.
There are occasionally unthought out boundary issues. Now that is equally true of psychodynamic work. There have been some examples, some very famous examples of abusive psychodynamic therapists who've not respected the boundaries whatsoever of their patients. So this is not just a knock at person-centred, it's a knock at all of us, actually. But it does seem to me that there isn't the same thinking about boundary issues as to whether a change of boundary is a response to what a client actually needs, or whether there is an alternative way of working with what the client needs. It's as if, and it goes back to the point on the negative, the emphasis on love, the emphasis on warmth and so on, leads to a sense of kindness, but a kindness that in some instances kills.
Occasional unthought boundary issues. I thought that was a very gracious way to put it. And, okay, I want to give some ground here. I think Michael's right. I think the boundary issue thing, it's not an area that would naturally have come to person-centred people to think about. It came in the psychodynamic world, first of all, understandably, because if you're maintaining a bigger power difference, you really need to pay attention to it. However, that's not to say that the person-centred world doesn't need to pay attention, because no matter what approach we take, there's always a power imbalance. And with some clients, that's actually particularly pronounced, even though we wouldn't have guessed it. I mentioned earlier, I could behave in exactly the same way to two clients. With one, I would be being directive and the other not. Some clients are much more vulnerable than others. And so I've got to, with a very vulnerable client, I've got to be especially careful about the boundary issue and how the client is seeing it. So I think we've learned something from the psychodynamic world in terms of, hey, come on, let's pay attention to this frame. And maybe the decisions we make are slightly different, but at least we're making intelligent decisions now. We're thinking about the process. However, we must be really wary of going overboard on the boundary thing. I think there's lots of examples in the last 5 or 6 years in relation to the complaints process of British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy, where it got to a stage that it was getting impossible to practice as a person-centred therapist in relation to the old code. You know, the old code had sort of, 27 clauses, and the person complaining would tick any number, usually 26. And it became a tick box situation with the old code of ethics. I was so pleased BACP went to the new ethical framework, where now things are phrased in terms of principles. Now I can kind of defend myself in terms of principles. I can't defend myself against I failed to contract properly with the client because the client reported I failed to contract properly with them. I can't fight against that very easily, but I can defend myself against principles, or I can address principles. Also too, in training and in practice and supervision, I can think about principles. If I've got to think of, have I ticked all these boxes, then that's not ethical working. So I think BACP sort of pulled itself back there and must be praised a lot for it. It's just a pity there's a lot of cases that still go back a long time. But that really was narrowing our practice so much that we were thinking structurally rather than functionally. Thinking structurally, are we doing the right things? Instead of thinking functionally, what's happening here? What's happening in my relationship? What do I need to attend to?
And the last of my points that I want to make is this. And this may seem a very strange point to make, but it strikes me time and time again when I hear or even when I see videos of person-centred people at work. There is no room for the therapist. It's all the attention is on the client. And what the therapist is doing is being warm, empathic, congruent, self-disclosing if that relates to what the client is saying and so on, but it's all related to the client. There is no working on the relationship between the therapist and the client, which is absolutely crucial to the relationship with, in psychodynamic work. And I'll give you two examples of this. One example comes from an analysis done by a communicative psychotherapist called Ivan Thorpe of the Rogers Cathy film, which those of you who are person-centred will know very well, I'm sure. And he analyzes it from that particular psychoanalytic perspective. Early on in the session, Cathy says that she feels very frightened of new male relationships. And Rogers simply reflects that back to her. You're very frightened of new male relationships. She repeats that going out with other men lately is very strange. And Rogers reflects that back. It's very strange. And then he picks up the loss of her husband, which she has mentioned, which is actually a very interesting example of an interpretation, because he's put together and taken out something she said earlier, put it together with something you just said. Very interesting interpretation, a sort of transference interpretation, actually, although it doesn't relate to him. And the weakness of it is that he doesn't pick up how strange she feels with him. Having not met him before, being on film, under lights, and so on. He doesn't pick that up at all. Now, a psychodynamic therapist, the first thought would be, talking about a strange man, she might be talking about me as well. And Ivan Thorpe suggests that his response would have been, I am, in a sense, a new male relationship too. And I understand that you agreed to be my client, and I guess that brings an assumption that there needs to be some opening up taking place on your part. But now that you're here in this public situation, how can you stay safe and be open with me at the same time? Now that, actually, I'm not a communicative psychotherapist, and I think they are far too rigid sometimes, but I do think that they really bring in the therapist-client relationship time and time again, what's actually going on between the two of them. And that does seem to me to be a glaring error on part of a psychodynamic therapist not to pick that up. I understand that Rogers didn't want to, maybe didn't feel it was appropriate to, and so on, but that would have been a very important one to pick up. And the other interesting example is this, and I shall finish here. Brian Thorne's made a film, which he made in Leicester once, where he brought a client of his across on the train from Norwich to Leicester in order to be filmed in the studio in Leicester University. That in itself was a strange thing for a psychodynamic therapist to do, to come across on a train with their clients to make a film. But nevertheless, I'll bypass that one. In the course of this, in course of the setting up the film, the client had said beforehand, we learned this later, the client said beforehand to Brian that she couldn't go onto the film unless she had a glass of spirits, a gin or something like that, by her side. I forget the precise spirit that it is. And they agreed that she could have this. And in the course of this session, Brian says to her, and of course you needed that spirits. And this is on film. And she says, you said we wouldn't talk about that on film. And he doesn't take it up at all. He leaves it. And right at the end, when they come off the session and they're reflecting on it, she says how very, very angry she was that it was there. Now, my wife and I, who used to teach a course called The Therapeutic Relationship, which is an indication of what the stress we put on it in the psychodynamic field, we showed this film, and what we would do afterwards would be to set up how a psychodynamic therapist would have approached it. And we stayed to the script all the way through until the point at which I, as it were, as Brian, said to my wife, as it were, as Brian's client, and of course you needed the spirits there to survive the session. The rest of the session could never go the same after that, because my wife immediately exploded, playing the client. But then, as the client did on the film, then it subsided and we went on. But as we went on, there was reference after reference after reference, obliquely, to this breaking of the confidence. And I kept bringing it up. kept working on it, as well as on the journey across. Now, it seems to me that is an example of the way the psychodynamic therapist says the relationship is actually important, what goes on there. And a particular example in psychodynamic work, this is the point I will finish, is displacement. It's what we call displacement. That is, when a client speaks about a situation outside the counselling room, the first thought of any psychodynamically trained therapist must be, is this actually about us? Doesn't mean that that is it interpreted straight away, but it is always, is this about us? And if it becomes possible, and it seems right, that interpretation will be made, so it will be brought into the room and you'll actually be working on the relationship with the client and yourself. And that's the point where I wish to stop.
Thank you. Dave.
It's always difficult in this situation to know where to begin. Maybe I'll see if I cover the points. The taping one's an interesting one. I've never made commercial videotapes of work with clients. I thought of making them with actor clients and didn't think that was worthwhile. And why I didn't do it was actually because of that last tape you're talking about. I think it was Louise, the video. I remember once meeting Louise, and this was, I think, 12 years after she'd made that videotape, by which time she was a therapist and a therapist trainer. And she told me that the day before she'd been in Nottingham, I think it was, and she had met herself, or at least she'd met students who had met her the day before, but the her they had met was 12 years ago. And it really alerted me to the ethical issues involved in making these videos, because they go on, their life goes on, and people who are the clients move on from there. Interestingly, I wrote to Leicester University, to the audiovisual people who made the videotape, and I got no reply for 3 months, and I thought, typical. And then 3 months later, I did get a reply which said, sorry for the delay, and that's because we have taken this really seriously, and we've thought about this, and we've taken it to our ethical committees, and we've decided there's a real point here, and we're taking this off the market. There's nothing we can do about the hundreds of copies that are out. And I thought it's an interesting ethical issue, because people, but that's a kind of aside to what we're about. The Kathy one, I'm going to pick on that one because I think I would have done it differently to Brian there, because that's a very clear change in the frame, so to speak, and that needs to be addressed. But with the Kathy one, I think I can understand Roger's going the way he did on it, because it's a first session, and in person-centred, yes, lots of connections will come into our mind, but particularly in a first session, we're really trying to keep it as open as possible, even though it's a glaring thing, you know, and our interpretive or analytic mind screams for us to show how smart we are.
I suppose I often feel, you know, what is all that about, and why do I feel vulnerable with it? And, you know, I'd like to hear the arguments.
Well, I've felt bashed by psychoanalytic people, actually, I have to say, sometimes. I was responsible, as Dave will know, a couple of years back, you will have seen it in counselling, for trying to see if we could frame a statement about what mature counsellors, who they were like, and whether we could, in some way or another, resolve this thorny issue about who are psychotherapists and who are counsellors, and actually saying what we're looking at is maturity, not what you call yourself. So we were trying to define it. And I had a letter from somebody which was very, very snooty, and telling me that, of course, I couldn't really say anything on this because I hadn't been trained properly. So, I mean, I wrote back and said, what do you mean? He said, well, you haven't been trained in the Psychoanalytic Society. I said, you're reminding me of the old debates that there used to be in the Anglican Church and the Roman Catholic Church. But you can't be a real priest because you're not being ordained by a Roman Catholic bishop. And this person said, you know, if you'd had a proper training. So I wrote back, well, I was actually in therapy with the president of the British Psychoanalytic Society. Is that proper training? But, you know, so it is that real put-down that you get. But it was from somebody in training. And I think you always need to be aware that you maybe you would find that some of your colleagues could also put down as well. Because the nature of training is that you've been turned out You think you've arrived somewhere, but you actually still feel uncertain somewhere. And this is why we are into this thing about the really interesting thing is that when you've got really experienced therapists, they work very similarly. And the reason is, I think, that they have been able to put away a lot of their the training that's there and find themselves and how they want to be. Now, Winnicott once said, it takes 10 years to get over your training in order to become yourself. You know? And Peter Lomas, who is also trained at the British Psychoanalytic Society, he said, well, that's the fault of the training. It shouldn't take 10 years. You should actually come out the training being your own person.
A space somewhere for you reacting to the nature of the client you've got and the institution you're in, rather than having to rigidly stay in the orientation you've been trained in.
I think that's probably
Yeah.
yours more than mine.
And yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think you analysed it very well, if I can use that word. You know, because you included the nature of the context in which you're working, and that's vitally important to recognise the nature of the context and what its norms allow. You know, and that example you've given, that's an incredibly. I would imagine the norms are very tight around that, and it's not just what he might expect and what he's got used to receiving. It's also the other people in that context that could make it very difficult for you to be any other way. It sounds the way you described it, like you were both locked into a scenario that very much restricted the, you know, the.
And everything is observed, not heard or
Yeah.
watched.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean these are vital variables. I really think they are vital variables. Another one, and it's not your point, but it's so relevant to what we've been talking about. Another very important variable is the vulnerability of the client. We in person-centred therapy would talk about the client's locus of evaluation, and you would find yourself working, even as a person-centred therapist, in quite a different way with the client who with a profoundly externalised locus of evaluation than with a client with a fairly internalised one. The client with a fairly internalised, in other words, as my daughter 3 years old once put it, I'm my own boss, which is wonderful. A client with a fairly internalised locus of evaluation, it's quite easy. Things can move fluidly. A client with an externalised one, you're aware all the time that that client is likely to be using anything you say as a means of direction because they're so vulnerable they need to do it. So, and I think that applies to both our approaches, that we would work in very different ways with a client that varied in that way.
Okay, so we're now just going to move on to the last section, which is looking at the increasing similarities between the psychodynamic and person-centred therapies. And both speakers are going to take some time, and then at the end we'll have time for questions. So, Dave?
Okay, I'm going to kick this one off. Increasing similarities between psychodynamic and person-centred therapies. I put learning with each other, which is my kind of optimistic. And I'm very positive. One of my motivations for doing this is that I see us having two big operations going here, really. And I think Elke's right. You know, ours is less well developed. Boy, we've got some numbers though. And we've got some popular appeal with clients as well. And you've got a big operation too, in many ways. It's got history, it's got depth, it's got breadth, it's got all sorts of things. And it's got a lot more people than are here today. And I thank the psychodynamic people who are here today. What if we got our act together? That could be amazing if we could somehow dispel some of these things we're talking about. Because I think a lot of the difficulties we have with each other are more to do with our less competent fringes, or people who are less experienced or more frightened or whatever. I think, you know, we've got a lot more similarity than we know. And if we could really get that together, wow, what we could do. Where are we? For instance, both approaches eschew, I think this is true, both approaches eschew a problem-centred approach. Both are aware of the dynamics of the whole person and seek to work within that whole, and in shared contradiction to many other psychological therapies. If we were, for instance, the health context, a lot of my employees employ 30 counsellors who work in health contexts, and day out they have to kind of struggle between the dissonance of the medical model around which frameworks are established and the person-centred model. Sometimes they moan about their institution not being person-centred, and I say to them, of course it's not person-centred, it's an institution, it's got to be institution-centred. That's another story. But it's quite hard, that work, and I imagine it must be same must be true for a lot of psychodynamic workers, the working in contexts that really where the model is very different from theirs. I just wonder what we could get together. I mean, long ago, psychology sold its soul to the medical model. A medical model that's perpetuated the myth that the behavioural manifestations of psychological difficulties will have both common etiologies and common treatments. It's a straightforward medical model. Psychology has given way to that. It's wonderful working on these committees nowadays along with psychology colleagues. I can say that because that's my background too. And seeing how much psychology has changed and see how they've developed their subject to fit the model, and I think lost an awful lot of the power of their subject. Anyway, it'd be fascinating to see the counter-arguments which together we could make in those contexts. I think the very fact that we would be arguing together would you know, catch people's attention. I think person-centred therapy is paying more attention to psychodynamics, albeit with a very strict phenomenological emphasis. I think Michael once described me as a psychodynamicist. I've said that already. I didn't quite know how to respond to it. I think it's probably true, although we will have to be very careful with our limits with that. It's okay, it's fine to look at and identify processes, but we need to leave enough of the variability of the theory to the individual level. Otherwise we run the danger of getting that theory imposed on the individual I mentioned earlier. Also too, in that regard, I think Margaret Warner's work on fragile and dissociative process is a really good example. I think more psychodynamic workers, I'm sure this is true, are paying attention to the real relationship if we look over the last 20 years, as well as the transference relationship. It's sometimes very interesting to read, particularly psychoanalytic journals, and see them struggle with processes and concepts. And we've got words for them, and we've kind of got a different language already, you know, laid down. It's very interesting. I'm thinking particularly of the Boston group. It's very interesting reading some of their work, and to hear that they're evolving their own language for concepts we've had. I mean, an example of that too is more attention to empathy instead of, as was historically the case, in very classical psychodynamic work where empathy was really just seen as a form of interpretation, if you like, a form of communicating interpretation. It's receiving much more attention. For instance, the work of Kohut and colleagues. Although it's very interesting if you actually try and analyse their use of the term. It's not quite empathy as we would know it. Ute Binder, a German person-centred theoretician and therapist, describes that as cognitive social perspective taking. That empathy that Kohut's describing, cognitive social perspective taking. It's almost a bit like trial identification in a sense. It's like putting yourself in the other person's place and sort of using your mind to imagine, you know, that social perspective. That's her analysis of the use of the term empathy in that context, whereas we would describe empathy from person-centred in a much fuller way. But interesting to see the growing commonalities. I've drawn a few hypotheses, just 4, and I'm going to do little more than list them. Hypothesis 1, experienced, competent and confident therapists from within both person-centred and psychodynamic traditions would find a great deal in common and would be able to learn a great deal from each other. Hypothesis 2, less experienced and perhaps less competent and confident therapists from either tradition would need to defend their positions most vehemently and could not so readily entertain the possibility of similarities. 3, the two approaches emphasise their criticism of each other to an unreal degree. When we criticise each other, we are imagining the worst practice of each other. And 4, person-centred and psychodynamic specialists could join together to put a combined case for the relationship-oriented therapies, in contradiction to the problem-oriented emphasis within the health centre. How powerful would we be together?
This is a book called The Therapeutic Environment, and it's written by an American person-centred therapist and a British psychodynamic therapist, and they say this in the personal introduction: we have different learning styles, different experiences, don't see eye to eye on many issues, don't think alike, and don't write in the same way. At times, frustrations with each other and ourselves have taken centre stage more than the content, which we also regularly disagreed on. In fact, it would have been much easier, although we think not better, for either one of us to have written this book alone. The differences between us caused significant problems, yet other essential things held us together as we worked through our relationship, therapy concepts, and this book. In the end, the differences, doubts, anxieties, and struggles were not enough to outweigh our commonalities, hopes, our alliance, our respect, and our motivation to succeed and learn. And I think that's a very good example of that sort of cooperative work that can be done by people from very different persuasions. So, learning from each other. Secondly, what we have in common is the centrality of the therapeutic relationship. We may differ in the way in which we choose to take up one aspect of it rather than another. But that would be precisely the same, I think, of any two person-centered therapists or any two psychodynamic therapists, that what they actually take up would be different, and the reason that what they take up would be different was because they are different people, and the relationship between them and their client is going to be different. So we share that, and yet we can go on exploring that together. Thirdly, there are signs of interest in the dynamics of the self. I think I want to extend this bit, actually, now, because since putting that heading up, it seems to me the more I hear from both Dave and also Elke talking about psychopathology just now, leads me to think that there are so many more things that are being explored in person-centered work than we who are outside it know about, and we ought to know more about it, as indeed so the person-centered people within ought to know more about it too. It's interesting, and it's very hard, this one, because sometimes when I hear, Dave, you saying something like, with great enthusiasm, the parts of the self, I do think, well, Freud, of course, did say I over I, it, which is the German as properly translated into English. He could recognize three parts of the self, and since then object relations has realized that we are peopled by many selves. And the hard thing, I think, in being engaged in it is not to get into the position of saying, well, we have been there, we know that. And the hard thing is because you are coming from it from a different experience in a different position, and you will have other things to say, new things to say, even though sometimes there is going to be a clear overlap between things that we have said and things that you are now saying. And I think Elke is right. It's one of the difficulties of age. It is that it took a long time for people to overthrow Freud and say they could think for themselves, and it's taking a fair time, I guess, to overthrow Rogers and say you can think for yourselves. But there's a very, very good example of it today in what you've been hearing. And I think the last thing that I want to put up is healthy respect for differences, because I don't want to end up with a sort of wishy-washy eclecticism, or even a wishy-washy integrative approach. There's a very lovely story which I tell on some of my workshops of the Rabbi Isaac, an old, obviously Jewish man who lived in Krakow. And he had a dream, and his dream was that if he were to go to Prague and he was to find the King Charles V Bridge, which goes over the river to the Royal Palace, and he were to go under the bridge onto the bank, and a certain spot he was to dig under into the bank, he would find buried treasure. Rabbi Isaac was very old, and he had the dream once, and he had the dream a second time, and had the dream a third time, and it wouldn't stop coming, this dream. So eventually he walked all the way from Krakow to Prague, which is a very long way for an old man in the days before transport. And when he arrived in Prague, he saw, as in his dream, just as he had seen it in his dream, the King Charles V Bridge, and he saw underneath the bridge that led to the Royal Palace over the river, the bank, just as he'd seen it in his dream, and he could see the spot just as he'd seen it in his dream where he needed to dig for buried treasure. But what had not been in his dream, which was there in reality, was the palace guards. And so he waited, because he was a little innocent, thinking that guards would go off duty and he'd have an opportunity to dig. But they didn't go off duty. they changed, but there were always guards there. And he waited around for 2 or 3 days, and not unnaturally, the captain of the guard was suspicious and wondered what he was up to. So he approached him and he said, "Old man, what's the trouble with you? What are you hanging around here for?" And he said, well, quite innocently, he said, "Well, sir," he said, "I had a dream. I had a dream that if I came to Prague and at the King Charles V Bridge, and under the river there was a bank, and there's a certain spot on the bank. If I dug there, I'd find buried treasure." And the captain of the guard roared with laughter, and he slapped him heartily on the back, and he said, "You stupid old man, you actually believe in dreams? You believe in dreams? Why, I've had a dream several times now that if I went to Krakow, and I went to a particular street in Krakow, and he described the street, and I went to a particular house in Krakow, and he described the house, and I went to the back room, and I dug under the stove, I'd find buried treasure." "Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you, sir," said the rabbi, because he recognized the street, and he recognized the house, and he recognized the room, because it was his own. And he was scuttled back to Krakow, and he dug under the stove, and he found buried treasure. But the moral of the story is that you have to pass over into someone else's territory before you find the treasures in your own backyard. And it isn't that you have to adopt what they're like, but they make you see yourself in a new perspective, and that, I think, is the healthy respect for differences that I would like to see continuing.
Right. Well, it's now question time for either party.
Untrustworthy about human beings could lead to, ultimately, a model in which people need something doing. That's the danger to me. Of the,
No,
of the
I don't
difference.
I don't think the two things hold, actually. For me to say that we are treading an edge is simply to say that's the way people are. It doesn't mean I don't trust people. If they go over the edge, I trust them still as much as... and I don't think the word trust applies. I'm still with them as much as they go over the edge as when they come back. It will change how I feel in all sorts of ways. I want to say that my trust is not in the person, the patient so much, the client, but in the process between the two of us. That's where my trust lies. That I believe that if I and he or she can work well together, and that actually is quite rather important, because with some people it isn't going to be possible to work well together, either because I have blocks or because they have blocks. But if we can work well together, I trust the process to get me there. Now, how it will go and what it will happen, I don't know. But I think you're confusing two different aspects, actually. I need to allow people to flip over into being aggressive and cruel and sadistic and so on, and still trust them. Well, I think the example that's been given out there is that that however much you trust the actualising tendency, there are going to be some people for whom life has been so tough that it's none of their fault, but that it's very difficult to see that it will move very far.
Yeah, can I just... That's a good one, because I would actually agree with that. And you used the word context earlier, and that's what I add to the therapeutic conditions when I write about it. Not that it's another condition, it's not, but the therapeutic context is very important. And if I'm not working in what I call a sufficient therapeutic context, then all the therapeutic conditions in the world aren't going to do it. If I was trying to work with some of my veterans I was talking about, I worked with them 1 hour a day, 6 days a week, you know, each patient. And if I were to pull them into my fancy office once a week, forget it. The context isn't sufficient for them to be able to engage a process. So there's another variable that's separate from the conditions. I want to add something else, and I don't think this is necessarily a difference between person-centred and psychodynamic, but I think it's a useful one. The difference between the potentiality model and the deficiency model. I think it's a very useful one in our society. We might align on the same side with this, I think, that so much of our society is geared to the deficiency model. It's almost impossible to get development funding in the areas of social work, social services, health, unless what you describe is a project in deficiency model terms. So in other words, we just recently got a lot of money to start a counselling in schools project. I must admit, a lot of that project thing was supplied in the language of which it would be judged and heard in deficiency model terms. That given a counselling service, given that individual attention for pupils being able to do some of the developmental things, that some of the hypotheses we would make would be that this would reduce, that would reduce, this would increase. That's deficiency model thinking, that young people need topped up with this or that they're basically deficient. My own thinking is actually potentiality model, which is if you create conditions, then the young person will be free of some of the oppression they were before, will be able to think in different ways and maybe take on new things. You can't predict what they'll take on, so you can't define it in deficiency model ways. But that potentiality model is really what I think counselling is about, certainly most forms of counselling, and certainly both our forms. But our culture isn't that way. Research money, grants, development money is not given for projects that are framed in potentiality model language. Sometimes we have to be a little bit clever and frame them both ways.
I don't know if there's any last minute things either of you would like to say, because we are now hitting 3 o'clock, so
I just want to say
comments?
how pleased I have been to do this and to do it with Michael. And I was enthusiastic about the idea of doing it with Michael because in 1 or 2 other situations, we fought like dogs. And the other people, I remember one in particular, I'm sure you remember, the other people were so embarrassed and they thought this was terrible, whatever. And it was fine by us because, I mean, I think I can speak for both. We have a very deep respect and liking for each other, so that makes it easy to fight. This has been an easy fight compared to that one.
It is, isn't it, actually? Yes, it is very hard, isn't it, to be that difficult with each other. But it's been a very good day, yes. And Adesha, I want to thank Dave for having the idea in the first place and for doing so much of the preparation too, because he knows how to use PowerPoint and I don't.
The secretary knows.
So just to round up, I'd like to say thank you both very much for what has been a really stimulating and thought-provoking day, and real privilege to kind of be the thorn in the middle of the two of you. And I'm sure that other people would also like to thank you both for, coming here today for us.